At a family dinner, when the room was filled with the sound of cutlery and chatter, someone leaned back in their chair, smirked, and said the words that sliced deeper than a knife. "What do you even know? You never had a real education." The room went still for half a second, and then the laughter came, quick, sharp, echoing against the walls. It wasn't the kind of laughter that invites you in. It was the kind that pushes you out, that marks you as less, as other, as small. I sat there with my fork still in my hand, my food untouched, and let the sound wash over me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. My silence gave them what they wanted, the illusion that they were right. And in that silence, the years of labor I had carried on my back felt like they were being erased in an instant. Every day I had woken before dawn, every hour spent building a life without the cushion of classrooms or diplomas, every lesson learned the hard way, with skin cracked and hands raw, dismissed, reduced to nothing more than a missing piece of paper on a wall. They thought it was clever, that insult. They thought it was harmless fun, a truth too obvious to sting. But for me it landed heavy. It pressed down on the part of me that still remembered being young and wanting to study, wanting to sit in lecture halls with notebooks open and minds stretched wide. Life hadn't given me that choice. Where others had exams, I had shifts. Where others had professors, I had bosses barking orders. While others wrote essays, I counted bills, trying to keep food on the table. The laughter carried on without them realizing what they were really mocking. They weren't mocking the lack of a diploma. They were mocking survival, sacrifice, resilience. They were mocking the countless nights I had come home too tired to eat, the times I had chosen responsibility over ambition. To them, education was a certificate. To me, it had been the world itself, teaching through hardship, through work, through failure, through persistence. I sat still, staring at the table, my jaw locked to keep words from spilling out. Because what good would they do? No one at that table wanted my story. They wanted their laughter, and so I gave it to them, quietly, without protest. But inside, something shifted. A sting turned into a scar into a vow. Their words wouldn't define me. Their mockery wouldn't be the final word. They had no idea what I had already set in motion. No idea what documents lay signed in a drawer in my house. No idea what gift was waiting, hidden, growing closer to the day it would be revealed. They thought I was nothing more than a man without schooling. But one day, they would walk into a building, see the plaque on its wall, and learn whose name stood there. That night, as their laughter echoed in my ears, I told myself the truth they refused to see. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their applause. The future itself would speak for me. Friends, let's take a short pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories to you. And now, let's continue. The silence that followed me home that night was not the silence I had always known. I had lived much of my life inside quiet mornings before work when the world still slept, quiet nights at my desk when the only sound was the scratch of a pencil or the hum of a lamp. Silence had been a companion once, a shield against the noise of the world, a place where I could breathe and think. But that night, silence turned cruel. It pressed on my chest like weight, echoing their laughter, replaying those words over and over until they carved themselves into me. You never had a real education. I sat alone, staring at the worn wood of my table, and felt the shame settle in like a shadow I could not shake. It was not because I believed them. Deep inside, I knew the truth of who I was, of what I had built, of the sacrifices I had made. But shame does not always come from lies. It comes from the sting of knowing others see only the parts you lack, never the parts you gave everything to create. They did not see the buildings that stood because of my labor. They did not see the families fed because of my sacrifices. They did not see the nights I came home exhausted, but still managed to give what I had left. No, all they saw was a man without a diploma. It burned because it reduced me to absence. They counted me not by what I had given, but by what I had been denied. They measured me by the gaps in my life instead of the ground I had gained. And in that moment, I realized how fragile dignity could feel when weighed against the careless judgment of others. The shame wasn't mine, not truly, but it clung to me all the same because there is no defense in the face of laughter. Laughter is louder than reason. Laughter doesn't wait for explanations. I closed my eyes and thought back to the years I had wanted more. The dream of classrooms, of notebooks filled with equations, of professors who could open doors I never even knew existed. But dreams, for me, had never been free. They cost time, they cost money, and I had neither to spare. So I chose work instead, because someone had to keep the lights on, someone had to put food on the table, someone had to survive. Every time I traded learning for labor, I told myself it was temporary. But temporary stretched into years, and years became a life. By the time I looked back, I was already too far down that road to turn around. And now they laughed at the road I had walked. They saw no value in the scars it had given me, no worth in the lessons life had beaten into me. They wanted proof that hung in frames, certificates with seals and ribbons. I had none. All I had was calloused hands, tired eyes, and the quiet knowledge that I had endured. But endurance, to them, was invisible. That night I felt the shame in every corner of the room, in every reflection I caught of myself in the window. And yet, beneath the shame, something else flickered. A whisper, faint but steady. They do not know the whole story. They saw only the surface, only the gaps. They did not see what was hidden, waiting, almost ready to step into the light. I let the shame wash over me, let it burn me, because I knew that one day it would turn into something else. And when that day came, their laughter would fall silent. Memory has a way of cutting deeper than any insult, because it reminds you not only of what was, but of what was lost. After their laughter faded and the quiet shame settled into me, I found myself drifting back to the years when education had been more than a word. It had been a dream I carried like a fragile flame. I remembered being young, hungry to learn, staring at books I could not afford, standing outside the windows of classrooms, where light spilled onto desks I would never sit at. There had been a time when I thought I might make it inside, that if I worked just a little harder, saved just a little more, the door would open. But life had its own lessons, and they were not written in textbooks. Instead of lectures, I had shifts. Instead of professors, I had foremen barking orders. Instead of chalkboards filled with formulas, I had warehouses filled with crates, scaffolding that swayed under my feet, and nights so long that dawn seemed like a cruel joke. While others scribbled notes in the margins of textbooks, I scribbled hours on a time card. My education measured not in grades, but in exhaustion. I remembered the smell of sweat and metal, the sound of machines roaring so loud they drowned out thought, the ache in my hands that no amount of rest could soothe. Each day was a test, but not the kind with paper and ink, the kind where failure meant hunger, eviction, another bill left unpaid. And so I passed, day after day, not with honors, but with survival. My diploma was not framed on a wall. My diploma was the roof that stayed over my family's heads, the meals that found their way to the table, the electricity that flickered on when the switch was pressed. And yet, those memories carried a shadow of longing. There were nights when I came home, collapsed into a chair, and stared at the books I'd collected secondhand. Their spines were worn, their pages yellowed, but to me they were treasures. I read them when I could, slow and clumsy, sometimes nodding off with my head against the page. Those books were my stolen lectures, my secret classroom. No one handed me a certificate for those hours, but I knew what they gave me. They gave me ideas, visions, the seeds of something greater than the walls I was building during the day. Still, the longing never left. It sat in me like an ache I could not cure. I wanted to walk into a hall of learning, to hear my name called in a room that echoed with knowledge instead of orders. But every time I thought I might reach for it, reality pulled me back. Rent, bills, responsibilities that education could not pay for. So I let the dream drift, like a balloon released into the sky, knowing I would never catch it again. And now, years later, they laughed at me for not having what I once craved more than anything. They laughed without knowing that the cost of my absence in classrooms had been paid in full, with labor, with sacrifice, with choices I never wanted to make but had to. Their laughter was easy. Their education had been given. Mine had been taken, traded, sacrificed. Yet even as those memories ached, they also fueled me. Because if I could not sit in classrooms, I could build them. If I could not have the education I dreamed of, I could ensure that others did. That thought, that quiet ember, burned brighter every time the memory of my own longing returned. It told me that my story wasn't finished yet, and one day they would see the lesson written not in books, but in stone and glass, in a building that bore my name. There was always one voice that rose above the others, sharp and cutting, the kind that carried through a room like broken glass. He was the one who laughed first, who laughed loudest, who made sure everyone else joined in. And every time he looked at me, he found the same way to twist the knife. "You're smart, aren't you? Then show us your diploma." The words came with a smirk, with that look of mock innocence that pretends to be a joke, but is meant to wound. Around him people chuckled, some awkwardly, some with genuine amusement, but all of them smiling. And somehow the smiles were worse than the words. Because laughter can sometimes be brushed off, but a smile, an approving smile at your humiliation, cuts deeper. It told me they agreed, or at least enjoyed seeing me diminished. I could feel their eyes on me, weighing me, reducing me not to what I had done, but to what I had not. They didn't see the nights I worked while they studied. They didn't see the sacrifices that had stolen the chance of a diploma from me. All they saw was absence, and absence, in their eyes, was weakness. The cruelest part was how natural it became for them. It was almost a ritual. Every gathering, every conversation that dared to brush against knowledge, against ideas, against anything bigger than the mundane, he would seize his chance. And the room would turn. Always the same question, always the same smirk. "Show us your diploma." As though education could be reduced to paper, as though wisdom, endurance, and vision could be dismissed with the absence of a framed certificate. I tried once, early on, to respond. I spoke of what I had built, of the knowledge I had gathered in silence, of the nights bent over books while others slept. But my words fell flat. They wanted entertainment, not truth, and so I learned to close my mouth, to stare at my plate or my glass, to let the moment pass while their laughter filled the air. My silence, they thought, was proof that they were right. But my silence was not agreement. It was survival. Yet each time it happened, each time that mocking voice rose and the smiles followed, something inside me hardened. It was not pride. I had lost too much of that already. It was resolve. Because I began to understand that their cruelty was not really about me at all. It was about the narrowness of their own vision. They believed that value could only be measured by a piece of paper. They believed that learning without recognition was worthless, and in their blindness, they had no idea what was coming. The mockery stung, yes. It left me raw and aching, made me feel like an outsider in rooms where I should have belonged. But it also built something in me they could not see, the quiet certainty that one day their laughter would turn to silence. One day the man they mocked for not having a diploma would give a gift to the world that no diploma could equal. And when that day came, they would finally understand the truth. Not all classrooms have walls. Not all lessons are taught by professors, and not all legacies are built on paper. Some are built in sweat, in sacrifice, and in the end, in stone. Silence became my armor, though at times it felt more like a cage. Each time their words landed, each time the familiar wave of laughter rolled through the room, I sat still and let it wash over me. I gave them no reply, no argument, no glimpse of the fire that burned beneath the surface. To them, my silence was surrender, proof that they had won, that I had no defense. They believed they had silenced me, but what they never understood was that silence has its own weight, and in me it was not weakness, it was patience. I let them believe their version of the story because I knew that arguing in those moments would be like shouting into the wind. They did not want to listen. They wanted victory, and I gave it to them, if only to keep my dignity intact. But in the stillness of my silence, a thought began to take root, deep and unshakable. Education is not a piece of paper. It is not ink stamped with approval, not a seal that tells the world you are worth listening to. Education is what you build from the lessons life has thrown at you. Education is what you give back when the world has already taken so much. I carried that thought with me like a stone in my pocket, heavy, grounding, unyielding. When their words tried to belittle me, I held on to it. When their laughter stung, I reminded myself. They measure by diplomas, but I measure by deeds. And deeds, unlike paper, cannot be burned, cannot be lost in a drawer, cannot be dismissed with a smirk. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying their words in my mind. The shame would rise, the anger would follow, and then the stone of that thought would settle me again. My life had not been wasted in ignorance. My life had been an education in responsibility, in sacrifice, in endurance. I had learned to survive when others would have faltered. I had learned to create with nothing but willpower. I had learned to value not what was handed to me, but what I could build with my own hands. That was a kind of education no classroom could have given. And slowly, that belief began to transform the silence inside me. It was no longer empty, no longer hollow. It became purposeful, a silence that was gathering strength, waiting for its moment. They thought I stayed quiet because I was beaten. The truth was I stayed quiet because the time had not yet come. One day, I would not need to argue, not need to explain. My answer would stand in brick and mortar, in glass and stone, in a building that bore my name and carried my gift. Until then, I carried the weight of silence with me, letting it press me down, harden me, shape me. Because I knew that silence, when finally broken, would not be a whisper. It would be thunder. No one knew what I carried in secret. They saw the rough hands, the worn clothes, the man who took shifts others avoided, who kept his head down and worked while others laughed. What they never saw was the quiet ritual I had lived by for years, setting aside what little I could, again and again, building something they could not imagine. Every paycheck, every coin saved, every sacrifice I made when I chose necessity over comfort, all of it was for a purpose I never spoke aloud. It was not for myself. I had long accepted that my chance at classrooms and diplomas had passed. My education had been written in labor, in responsibility, in survival. And though it had shaped me, it had cost me as well. But I could not bear the thought that the children of my town, the ones growing up with the same hunger in their eyes that I once carried, should face the same closed doors. They deserved to walk hallways filled with light, to sit at desks where ideas bloomed, instead of watching opportunities slip away. They deserved the kind of education that had been denied to me. And so, piece by piece, I built it. Not with hammers or concrete this time, but with patience and sacrifice. While others spent freely, I lived with restraint. While others sought comfort, I saved. There were years when it felt impossible, when the amount I had managed to put aside seemed too small to matter. But I reminded myself that even the tallest building begins with a single stone, even the strongest foundation with the first poured slab. What I was building was invisible to the world, but I could see it in my mind as clearly as if it already stood. No one knew that the nights I skipped meals, the times I wore old shoes longer than I should have, the moments I chose silence instead of indulgence, all served one vision, a gift that would outlast me. I wanted children who had never even heard my name to have the chance to discover, to dream, to build. I wanted the world to know that education is not a privilege for the few. It is the seed of every future. And if I could plant even one seed, then my life would mean more than every insult, every smirk, every laugh that had once tried to reduce me. In the privacy of my small home, I kept the records. Numbers carefully written, accounts meticulously guarded, documents signed quietly with no celebration. Each page felt like a promise, each figure like a step towards something greater than myself. To the world, I was a man without schooling. But behind the closed doors of my solitude, I was shaping an education larger than any diploma could ever carry. They mocked what I did not have, never realizing what I was giving. And one day, when the gift came into the light, they would see that the man they had dismissed as uneducated had, in truth, been teaching them all along, teaching them that legacy is not measured by paper, but by what you leave for others to learn from. The night I signed the papers, the world outside my window was asleep. The streets were empty, the air heavy with that peculiar stillness that comes only in the hours between midnight and dawn. Inside my small room, the lamp cast a warm circle of light across the desk, and in that light lay the documents that had taken me a lifetime to prepare for. Years of sacrifice, of silent saving, of enduring mockery and bearing humiliation, had all led to this moment. The papers were crisp, their edges sharp, their language formal and heavy with legality. At the top were figures so large they seemed almost unreal, numbers that represented not just money, but the weight of every hour I had worked, every coin I had tucked away, every luxury I had denied myself. And at the bottom there was a blank line waiting for me. I stared at it for a long time, my pen poised but unmoving. I thought of the boy I once was, staring through windows at classrooms I could not enter. I thought of the man I had become, standing on work sites with hands scarred and back bent, listening to others laugh at what I did not have. And then I thought of the children yet to come, the ones who would walk into a building filled with microscopes and books, with light streaming through tall windows, with teachers whose voices carried possibility instead of judgment. Children who would never know my face, but who would know the gift my name had secured for them. The silence was thick, broken only by the scratch of the pen when at last I moved. The ink bled into the paper, forming the letters of my name, steady and deliberate. It was not a grand flourish, not the proud signature of a man seeking glory. It was simple, but it carried everything I was. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every insult endured, it all condensed into that line of ink, my name, my truth, my legacy. When the pen lifted, I sat back and stared at the black letters. They looked so small compared to the numbers above them, but I knew which mattered more. The figures spoke of wealth. The signature spoke of will. Together, they would build something larger than either one could alone. Together, they would alter the course of a school, a town, perhaps even a generation. No one saw me that night. There were no cameras, no applause, no speeches, just me, the lamp, the papers, and the silence that finally felt not heavy, but holy. It was the silence of justice in its earliest form, the silence of truth waiting to be revealed. I closed the folder gently, almost reverently, as though it were fragile glass. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. They could laugh. They could mock. They could call me uneducated. But my name was written now, where it mattered most, not on a diploma, but on a promise that would stand long after their laughter faded, a promise that would one day rise in stone and steel, carrying forward a truth they had never cared to see. The signature was small, but it would change everything. The day arrived with a kind of brightness that felt almost deliberate, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The schoolyard had been transformed into a stage of celebration. Rows of chairs stood neatly arranged, banners fluttered in the breeze, and cameras were already in place, their lenses glinting in the sun. Children gathered in clusters, their voices buzzing with excitement, while teachers tried to calm them with gentle words that could not hide their own anticipation. The future was about to change, and everyone felt it. I stood at the edge of the crowd, quiet, unnoticed, the same way I had always stood. To most of the people there, I was just another face in the audience, a man without credentials, without status, without importance. They didn't see the weight in my chest, the years that had led me here. They didn't know that the ink on the documents, the ink of my name, was the reason they had gathered at all. And then my eyes found them, the ones who had laughed the loudest. They were sitting in the front rows, dressed in their best clothes, nodding at familiar faces, smiling at the cameras as if they belonged there, as if this ceremony was theirs to witness with pride. They looked certain, confident, assured of their place in this moment. To them, the story was already written, a wealthy benefactor, a name they recognized. Someone worthy of applause would be announced. They never imagined it could be me. I watched them settle into their seats, oblivious to the truth rising around them like a tide they could not stop. I wondered if they even remembered the words they had thrown at me, the smirks, the jokes about my lack of education. Perhaps to them it had been nothing, a passing amusement, but to me, those words had become chisels, carving scars that never faded. And now, those scars were about to speak louder than their laughter ever had. The ceremony began. The school director stepped up to the podium, his voice carrying across the yard, warm and proud. He spoke of a gift, of a vision, of someone who believed in the power of knowledge and the future of children. The crowd leaned in, hungry for the name. The children listened wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but sensing the importance. Teachers dabbed at their eyes with tissues, the weight of possibility pressing down on them. And in those moments, as the words of gratitude filled the air, I stood still, my heart beating so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. I looked again at the faces in the front rows, at their smug certainty, at their belief that they already knew the ending to this story. They didn't know. They had never known. And that was what made the moment so sharp, so electric, so just. I was still invisible to them. But not for long. The director stood tall behind the podium, his hands resting lightly on either side of the microphone. The sunlight caught the edge of his glasses, and for a moment it seemed as though the world had paused, waiting. A hush fell over the schoolyard, the restless murmurs of children quieting, the polite laughter of adults fading into stillness. Even the wind seemed to soften, as if the air itself leaned closer to hear the name that had not yet been spoken. He began with gratitude, his voice steady and strong. He spoke of the importance of education, of how knowledge builds not only minds but futures, how a single gift can ripple through generations. The words rolled across the rows of chairs, wrapping around each person seated there, pulling them into a moment they would not forget. The cameras drank in every syllable, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. This was not just an announcement, it was a revelation, a rewriting of the story everyone thought they already knew. I stood at the edge, still, silent, my hands clasped in front of me, feeling my heartbeat echo in my fingertips. Each word from the director brought us closer to the moment I had imagined in the quiet of my room, the moment that had carried me through nights of humiliation and silence. Years of saving, of sacrificing, of enduring mockery had all been leading here. Soon, my name would leave the shadows and step into the open air. In the front row, I saw them again, the faces that had mocked me, eyes bright, jaws set in smug expectation. They leaned forward slightly, eager, certain they knew who would be honored. Perhaps a well-known philanthropist, perhaps someone with influence, perhaps one of them. They had lived so long believing that generosity and vision could never belong to someone like me, that I was incapable of more than labor. And in their certainty they had never once considered the truth. The director's voice swelled, his words deliberate now, measured, meant to hang in the air. Today we honor the gift of a man who believed in learning, even when the doors of classrooms were closed to him. A man who built with his own hands what life denied him in paper. A man whose name will forever be tied to this new science lab. The pause before the name felt like eternity. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and in that silence, every insult I had endured, every smirk, every laugh, seemed to vanish, swept aside by the weight of what was about to be spoken. And then, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, he said it. My name. It rang out across the yard, carried by the microphone, caught by every camera, etched into every ear. My name. Not mocked, not diminished, not forgotten, announced, honored, lifted into the light. For a moment, the world stood still. I saw heads turn, eyes widen, mouths fall open. I saw disbelief ripple across the rows, like a stone dropped into still water. And in the front row, the ones who had always laughed at me froze. The certainty drained from their faces, replaced first by shock, then by something else, something rawer, harder to disguise. The truth had landed, and it left no room for their laughter. My name hung in the air like a bell struck in the silence of a cathedral. It echoed not just from the speakers, not just across the yard, but through every memory of every insult I had endured. For a heartbeat, the entire place froze. Teachers with half-raised hands, children shifting in their seats, reporters caught mid-note with their pens suspended in the air. It was as if time itself bowed to the weight of that moment, holding it still, demanding everyone take it in. I felt it land inside me like a rush of air after drowning. For years I had been suffocating under laughter, under mockery, under the suffocating silence of erasure. And now, suddenly, my name was not a whisper in my own head, but a declaration before the world. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my body trembling as though every nerve remembered the years of humiliation, the nights of sacrifice, the sting of exclusion. But along with the trembling came release, a surge of something so pure it burned, vindication. The audience began to shift. Heads turned, people whispered, the director's words still ringing. Some faces lit with recognition, some with confusion, others with awe. But what I watched most closely was the front row, the very people who had once wielded my lack of education as a weapon against me. Their eyes widened, their smug certainty shattered. I could almost see the moment their memories collided with the present, when every cruel joke they had made, every smirk they had shared, recoiled back toward them with unbearable weight. They did not clap at first. They could not. Their hands remained still in their laps, while the applause began to rise elsewhere. Hesitant at first, then growing, swelling like a tide that would not be stopped. Children clapped with innocent excitement, teachers joined with tears in their eyes, and soon the entire space was filled with the sound of recognition. My name carried in that rhythm, no longer just letters, but truth turned into music. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over me. I thought of the boy I had been, staring through windows at classrooms he could never enter. I thought of the man I had become, bent beneath the weight of labor and insult, building silently while others mocked. And then I thought of the children who would walk into the new science lab, their futures bright, their opportunities limitless. And I knew this moment was no longer about me. It was about them. Still, I opened my eyes and looked again at the front row. Their mouths were tight, their faces pale, their eyes darting from one another to me and back again, as if searching for a way to undo what had just been revealed. But there was no undoing it. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it filled every corner of that place. For the first time, I did not feel small under their gaze. I did not feel diminished by their judgment. My name, once used as the butt of their jokes, now stood taller than their laughter ever had. The moment of truth had arrived, and it did not belong to them. It belonged to me. Their faces were the first place I looked after my name settled in the air, and what I saw in them was more powerful than any applause that followed. The ones who had laughed the loudest, who had cut the deepest, who had wielded my lack of schooling like a weapon, they sat frozen, their certainty cracked wide open, eyes widened, lips parted, and the easy smiles they wore only moments before dissolved into something raw and unguarded. Shock. The kind of shock that strips a person of their armor, leaving them bare in front of the very truth they tried to bury. I will never forget the way their bodies shifted, restless and uneasy, as though the chairs beneath them had suddenly become too hard, too unforgiving. Some averted their gaze, unable to look in my direction, as if the weight of my name hanging over them was too much to bear. Others stared straight ahead, their faces stiff, trying to hold on to the last threads of pride, but the trembling in their jaws betrayed them. They had lived so long in the comfort of their lies, and now, in one instant, that comfort was gone. These were the same mouths that once asked mockingly for my diploma, the same eyes that had rolled with disdain when I spoke of dreams, the same laughter that had silenced me, that had burned itself into my memory on nights when I wondered if perhaps they were right. And now those mouths could not form words, those eyes could not hold mine, and that laughter had vanished into a silence louder than any noise they had ever made. It was not revenge that filled me as I watched them. It was something more complicated, more human, a mixture of grief for all the years they had stolen from me with their ridicule, and relief that those years had not been wasted. There was sadness, too, in knowing that their vision had always been so small, so narrow, that they could not see beyond a piece of paper, beyond a framed certificate. But above all, there was vindication. They had tried to write me out of the story of education, and now they were forced to sit in the front row while the truth was read aloud. The applause around them only made their isolation clearer. Hands clapped, voices rose, children cheered with unfiltered joy, teachers whispered my name to one another with reverence. And in the middle of it all, those who had once laughed at me sat trapped in their own silence. They could not hide, they could not escape. They were forced to witness what they had always said would never happen. My name being honored where they believed it had no right to be. Their shock was not just an expression. It was justice written on their faces. It was the reversal of years of mockery, the breaking of chains I had carried in silence. And as I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart steady, I knew this truth. Sometimes the sweetest victory is not in what you say, but in what your silence forces others to see. The applause began hesitantly, a few scattered claps rising from the rows of children and teachers, but within seconds it swelled into a roar that filled the courtyard like a storm breaking open the sky. It was not polite, measured applause. It was the kind that comes from something deeper, from hearts moved and spirits awakened. And with every clap, with every voice that shouted my name, the weight of years began to lift off my shoulders. For the first time, the world wasn't looking past me. It was looking directly at me. I felt it before I fully saw it. The shift. Attention is a living thing, and in that moment it turned, leaving behind those who had sat smug in their front row seats. The eyes of the crowd no longer lingered on them, no longer sought their approval or echoed their laughter. Instead, all at once, it turned toward me, the man who had stood in shadows, who had been silenced with mockery, who had carried his truth alone for far too long. The applause guided their gaze, pulled it like a tide, until every eye in that place was fixed on me. The sensation was overwhelming. I had been invisible for so long that being seen felt almost unbearable, as if their recognition was too bright, too heavy. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath caught, and I thought for a moment I might falter under it. But then I remembered the boy I had been, standing outside the classroom windows, wishing for a chance to belong. I remembered the man I had become, sitting silent while others mocked me for what I lacked. And I realized that this moment was not a spotlight to shrink from. It was the place I had been walking toward my entire life. I raised my eyes, and when I did, I saw the difference etched into every face. The teachers looked at me with respect, the kind that only comes when someone has done something bigger than themselves. The children looked at me with awe, their young eyes wide, as though they were witnessing a kind of magic, proof that a man who had been denied education could still give it, in its purest form, back to them. And the parents, the community, even the strangers, there was recognition in their expressions. The quiet acknowledgement of dignity returned. Meanwhile, those who had mocked me seemed to shrink into the background, their presence swallowed by the applause that no longer belonged to them. They had once commanded attention with their voices, their laughter, their jeers, but now no one looked their way. Their power had evaporated in an instant, leaving them stranded in their own silence. And I did not need to gloat or point them out. The crowd had already delivered the verdict. Attention, once stolen from me, had returned. In that flood of recognition, I felt something break free inside me, not anger, not pride, but release. Release from the chains of invisibility. Release from the years of bearing shame that was never mine to carry. The applause was not just for the gift, not just for the building. It was for endurance, for survival, for truth. And as every gaze held me in that moment, I understood. I had not only reclaimed my place in the story, I had become the story. I rose slowly, not with the haste of a man eager to claim a prize, but with the steadiness of someone who had carried the weight of this moment for a lifetime. My knees felt heavy as I pushed myself up from the chair, the years of labor and silence pressing down on them, yet my steps were calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The applause swelled again, carrying me forward like a tide, and for the first time in my life I did not shrink from it. I walked into it. The aisle between the rows seemed impossibly long, and with each step I could feel the eyes of the crowd fixed on me. They weren't looking past me, weren't mocking, weren't searching for flaws. They were seeing me, truly seeing me, for who I was, for what I had done, for what I had given. Teachers reached out as I passed, their hands brushing mine, their eyes glistening with tears. Some whispered words of thanks, their voices trembling with sincerity. Children clapped harder, their young faces lit with admiration, as though in me they saw not just a man, but the proof that hope could be built from nothing. I moved slowly, absorbing every detail. The flutter of banners in the breeze, the smell of fresh paint on the new building behind the podium, the glint of cameras capturing what had once seemed unimaginable. Every second was etched into me, a reversal of years where I had walked unnoticed, where my steps had carried me into shadows instead of light. Now, each step forward was not just movement, It was reclamation. And then I saw them, the ones who had laughed the loudest. They were still seated, their applause absent, their bodies stiff with a discomfort they could not hide. Their eyes darted downward when mine met theirs, unable to hold the weight of what they had done to me, of what they had said. They looked small, diminished, as though the chairs that had once been thrones of their pride had turned into cages of shame. Words that had once flowed so easily from their mouths were gone now, caught in throats too tight with the bitter taste of truth. They could not rise. They could not speak. They could only sit and watch as the man they had dismissed walked past them, not bent under their judgment, but lifted above it. I felt no need to linger on them, no desire to strike back with gloating or anger. Their silence was louder than any defense I could have demanded. Their stillness was the justice I had waited for. They had laughed when I was invisible, but now, in the brightness of recognition, they were the ones unseen. When I reached the podium, I turned, and for the first time I faced them all, not as the man mocked for lacking education, but as the one who had given it back to their children. The applause rolled on, a living thing that filled the air, but I stood in it quietly, my chest rising with a breath I had been holding for years. This was not just a walk to the front. It was a walk out of silence, a walk out of shame, a walk into the place where truth finally lived. And behind me, those who had mocked me sat chained to the only thing they had left, the memory of their own words. The next morning, the city woke to my name printed in black ink across newspapers and glowing on the bright screens of their devices. Headlines carried it with certainty, without hesitation. New Science Center named after donor. It was there for everyone to see, not hidden in footnotes or whispered in passing, but declared boldly, as if the world itself was finally correcting a story that had been twisted too long. I bought a paper with hands that trembled more than they ever had lifting bricks or carrying beams. On the front page was a photograph of the building, its glass reflecting the early morning light, and beneath it, my name, etched into the caption. I traced the letters with my finger, as if I couldn't quite believe they were real, as if they might vanish the way recognition had always slipped from my grasp before. But they did not vanish. They stared back at me, steady, undeniable, unshakable. For years their words had chipped away at me. You never had an education. Show us your diploma. They had tried to strip me of dignity, to reduce me to absence, to make me feel less than whole. And I had carried that weight, silent, invisible, scarred by mockery that echoed in my mind long after the laughter had ended. But now, every line of every article stitched back what they had once torn apart. Every word written about the lab, every photograph of the ribbon cutting, every mention of my gift was a piece of dignity returned. I imagined them reading it too, the ones who had sat in the front row, certain that I would never matter, certain that I would always remain in the background of their stories. I imagined the moment their eyes scanned the headline, the moment my name struck them harder than any retort I had ever failed to give. They had laughed at my silence, but now silence belonged to them, a silence heavy with the weight of undeniable truth. And what struck me most was how justice had arrived. Not with anger, not with vengeance, not with me shouting to be heard. It had come quietly, written in ink, sealed by facts that could not be erased. Justice does not always thunder. Sometimes it whispers in the lines of a newspaper, in the photographs of smiling children who will one day learn in a building they never knew was born of my sacrifices. Sometimes it arrives in the stillness of morning, when you hold a paper in your hands and realize the world finally knows what you always did. I folded the paper gently, with reverence, as though it were something sacred, because in a way, it was. It was not just recognition, it was restoration. The dignity they had tried to take from me was mine again, not given by their approval, but by the truth itself. The new Science Center bore my name, and in that name lived more than memory. It lived vindication. It lived endurance. It lived the proof that no mockery, no absence of diplomas, no jeers or laughter could erase what had been built with sacrifice. Justice had not shouted. It had simply stood tall, written in stone, shining in glass, and printed in ink for all to see. I walked away from the building slowly, each step echoing with a weight I had carried for decades. Behind me, the glass shimmered in the afternoon sun, the new science lab rising proud and unshakable against the skyline of the town that once tried to keep me small. For years I had passed through these same streets with my head low, a man defined by what he lacked, by the paper I never received, by the classrooms I never entered. But now, as I turned back and looked at the structure carrying my name, I realized I was leaving something far greater than any diploma could ever give. The lab stood tall, not just as a building of brick and glass, but as proof. Proof that education is not measured in certificates, but in legacy. The children who would one day fill those rooms with questions, experiments, and discoveries would never know the sting of the words I endured. They would not see the scars of silence, the long nights of sacrifice, the shame of being mocked as unworthy. They would only see opportunity. They would only feel the door opening where mine had been shut. And in their learning, in their laughter, in their growth, the truth of who I was would live on. I thought of the voices that had once surrounded me, voices that told me I had no right to speak of knowledge, that sneered at me for lacking an education, that demanded to see diplomas I could never show. "You know nothing," they had said, again and again, until the words almost became chains I wore around my heart. But now the chains had broken. The building itself answered for me, louder than any defense I could have given. It declared in steel and glass what I had always known, but had never been allowed to say, that true education is not what you keep for yourself, but what you give to others. As I stood at the edge of the street, watching the sunlight slide across the new walls, I felt the years of silence fall away. The shame they had placed on me, the invisibility they forced upon me, the laughter that had tried to reduce me, all of it dissolved in the presence of the lab that bore my name. I was no longer just the man who lacked, no longer the shadow at the table where others mocked. I was the one who had built a future for children I would never meet. I was the one who had turned sacrifice into opportunity, silence into legacy. The city knew now. They could never take it back, never erase it, never laugh it away. My name would live on, not in ridicule, but in stone, etched into the plaque at the entrance, spoken in the stories of teachers, remembered in the lives of students whose journeys began in those classrooms. The lab was not just a gift, it was a verdict against those who had doubted me, who had tried to write me out of the story of education, a verdict that declared the truth plainly. I had given children a chance at the very thing I had been denied. I turned to leave, the sound of children's voices carrying faintly from the distance, their laughter filled not with mockery but with wonder. For the first time I felt light, not because the burden had disappeared, but because I had finally placed it where it belonged. The building would carry it now. The lab would hold my story long after I was gone. And as I walked away, I smiled with a quiet certainty that no insult, no laughter, no absence of a diploma could ever erase this truth. They had said I knew nothing, but now the entire city knew. I was the one who gave its children a future.